I'm not telling this story because I'm proud of every thought I had while living it. I'm telling it because silence almost erased me. For years, I believed love was proven by patience, by understanding, by staying calm even when something felt wrong. I was wrong about that. This is the story of how I learned that betrayal doesn't arrive screaming. It arrives quietly, wrapped in routines, excuses, and familiar smiles. What you're about to hear isn't about rage or destruction. It's about observation, restraint, and the slow return of self-respect. If you've ever ignored your instincts because you didn't want to lose the life you built, this story is for you. My name doesn't matter as much as the lesson. What matters is what happens when truth finally demands to be seen. I used to believe trust was quiet, something that lived in the background like a steady hum you didn't notice unless it stopped. Mark and I had been married for 11 years, long enough that people stopped asking how we met and started saying things like, "You two are solid." We lived in a calm Ohio suburb where the lawns were trimmed, the neighbors waved, and nothing dramatic ever seemed to happen. Mark kissed my forehead every morning before work and complained about traffic while pouring his coffee. At night, he came home late, loosening his tie and saying, "Work is just insane right now." I believed him because I wanted to. Wanting something to be true can be stronger than proof that it isn't. At first, nothing was obviously wrong. It was small shifts, tiny enough to excuse. His phone stayed face down on the counter. When it buzzed, he flipped it over quickly and said, "Probably spam." One evening I asked, "Who keeps texting you so late?" He smiled and said, "Just the guys from work." I laughed and replied, "They don't sleep, huh?" He shrugged. "Deadlines?" I nodded, pretending my stomach hadn't tightened. Then came the gym. Mark had never liked the gym. Suddenly, he went 4 nights a week. "Trying to be healthier," he said. I told him, "That's great," and meant it, even though I noticed the new cologne sharper than his old one. When I asked about it, he said, "Free sample at work." I smiled. "Smells nice." He kissed my cheek and walked away before I could ask more. At night, he lay beside me but felt far away. I would talk about my day, about a client who yelled or a recipe I wanted to try. He listened, but his eyes drifted. "Are you tired?" I asked once. He said, "Yeah, just stressed." I told him, "I'm here." He squeezed my hand and said, "I know." Something in his voice felt practiced. I told myself I was being insecure. I told myself marriage had seasons. I told myself love didn't always feel exciting. One afternoon, I called my sister and said, "Do you ever feel like you're imagining problems?" She laughed softly. "All the time." I felt relieved. If doubt was normal, then I was fine. The night everything shifted wasn't dramatic. I was folding laundry, half watching a cooking show. Mark's suit jacket was heavy in my hands. As I shook it out, a receipt slipped from the pocket and landed on the floor. I picked it up without thinking. It was from a restaurant I loved, one we used to go to on anniversaries. The date was from 2 weeks earlier. I scanned the total and froze. 2 meals, 2 desserts. Wine, my chest tightened. I sat on the bed, holding the paper like it might disappear. When Mark walked in, I asked casually, "Did you go to Luca's for a work dinner?" He paused. "Yeah, team thing." I looked at him. "You never mentioned it." He shrugged. "Didn't think it mattered." I nodded and said, "Okay." He went to shower. I stared at the receipt until the ink blurred. That night, he slept easily. I didn't. I watched the ceiling and listened to his breathing. I thought about all the times I'd suggested Luca's and he'd said, "Maybe another time." I thought about the gym, the phone, the distance. Still, I didn't confront him. Part of me hoped there was an explanation. Another part was afraid of what would happen if there wasn't. Over the next few days, I became quieter. Mark noticed. "You okay?" he asked. I said, "Just tired." He replied, "We both are." One evening he said, "You've been distant." I wanted to laugh. Instead I said, "Have I?" He smiled gently. "A little." I forced a smile back. I started paying attention in ways I hadn't before. When he laughed at a text, I noted it. When he stepped outside to take a call, I noticed how his shoulders relaxed. One morning I asked, "Who's your new project coordinator again?" He said, "Lisa." I nodded. "She seems busy." He laughed. "You have no idea." At dinner that night I said, "You seem happy lately." He said, "Things are finally moving at work." I asked, "Is that why you're home so late?" He replied, "I'm doing this for us." The word us echoed in my head. I wanted to believe him. I really did. I cooked his favorite meals. I asked about his day. I listened. Inside, something had started to wake up, something alert and restless. It whispered, "Watch, remember, don't rush." When Mark kissed me goodnight and said, "I love you," I said it back, wondering when love had started to feel like a question instead of an answer. I needed truth, not guesses, and once that decision settled inside me, everything changed. I stopped asking Mark questions because questions gave him room to shape answers. Instead, I watched. I listened. I remembered. I started noticing how often he checked his phone when he thought I wasn't looking. How his thumb moved fast, practiced, deleting before placing it back down. One morning, while he showered, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. I didn't touch it, I just looked. The name flashed for half a second before the screen went dark. Lisa, my heart didn't race. It went still, like something heavy sinking to the bottom of water. That day at work, I couldn't focus. Numbers blurred. Conversations passed without meaning. I kept hearing his voice in my head saying, just the guys from work. That night, I opened our shared bank account for the first time in months. At first, everything looked normal: mortgage, utilities, groceries. Then I slowed down. There were dinners I didn't recognize, coffee shops near his office I'd never visited with him, hotel charges labeled conference rate. My hands shook, but my mind stayed clear. Patterns formed slowly, like bruises under skin. I began saving screenshots, emailing them to an account Mark didn't know existed. I labeled everything with dates and times. It felt strange, like I was becoming a stranger to myself, someone who collected evidence instead of memories. One evening I asked casually, "Do you still work late on Thursdays?" Mark said, "Yeah, why?" I smiled. "No reason." He nodded and went back to his phone. I knew Lisa's face before I knew her role. Office holiday photos were still up on the company website. She stood close to Mark in one, smiling too easily. When I pointed it out once, months earlier, he'd laughed and said, "She photobombed." Now the memory felt different. I zoomed in on her expression, the familiarity in her posture. My stomach tightened, but I didn't look away. The confirmation came on a gray Tuesday afternoon. Mark said he'd be late again. "Client meeting," he said, grabbing his jacket. I waited 10 minutes, then followed him. My hands were steady on the steering wheel, even though my heart felt like it was pressing against my ribs. He didn't notice me as he turned into a small parking lot behind a quiet cafe. I parked across the street, low enough that my car blended in. Through the window, I saw them. Mark leaned forward, his body open, relaxed. He laughed in a way I hadn't heard in months. Lisa touched his arm as she spoke, her hand resting there like it belonged. When he smiled at her, it wasn't polite. It was intimate. I took photos, my phone heavy in my hand, not for revenge yet, for reality. For proof that I wasn't imagining this. That night when Mark came home, he said, "Long day." I replied, "I know." We ate dinner in silence. Afterward, I placed my phone on the table between us. "We need to talk," I said. His face shifted instantly. "About what?" I slid the photos toward him. "This." He stared for a full second too long. Then he laughed weakly. "You followed me," I said. "Answer the question." He exhaled and said, "It's not what it looks like." I replied, "Then explain it." He ran his hands through his hair. "She's a coworker," I said, "who you take to my favorite restaurant." Silence stretched. Finally, he whispered, "I didn't plan this." "I didn't plan to be lied to," I said. He stood up. "I was lonely." I stayed seated. "You were married." He said, "You've been distant." I laughed once sharp. "You disappeared first." He started crying then, real tears. "It was a mistake." I said, "Mistakes don't have weekly schedules." I asked, "How long?" He hesitated. That hesitation told me everything. 6 months, he said. I nodded. "Who knows?" He said. "No one." I replied, "Now I do." He reached for my hand. I pulled back. "Don't." I told him I needed time. He said, "I'll end it." I said, "That's your choice." He looked relieved, like forgiveness was already forming. "We can fix this," he said. I looked at him and thought about the photos, the receipts, the lies. "We'll see," I said. That night, I slept in the guest room. Mark stood in the doorway and said, "I love you." I didn't answer. In the dark, I stared at the ceiling, calm in a way that surprised me. Silence had turned into resolve. Whatever came next, I would be ready, and Mark had no idea what I was already planning. Revenge doesn't have to be loud to be effective. Sometimes it only needs patience and a clear mind. After the confrontation, Mark became careful in the way people do when they think they've been given a second chance. He cooked dinner twice that week, bought flowers, and kept saying, "I'm trying." I nodded, smiled, and thanked him. On the inside, I was already several steps ahead. I stayed because leaving too fast would have tipped him off, and I needed him relaxed, believing the danger had passed. I acted normal. I laughed at his jokes. I asked about his day. When he said, I ended it with Lisa, I replied, I hope so, and left it at that. At night, I lay beside him and listened to his breathing, not with love but with focus. I kept gathering everything. Messages he forgot to delete, emails he didn't realize synced to the family tablet, expenses he assumed blended in. I organized it all into folders labeled by date, like chapters of a book he didn't know he'd written. I met with a lawyer during my lunch break. Her office smelled like coffee and paper. She listened without interrupting, then said, You've been very thorough. I replied, I had motivation. She explained my options calmly. When she said, Financial protection comes first, I felt relief. I followed her advice, quietly opening an account in my name, redirecting part of my paycheck, copying important documents. At home, Mark remained unaware, talking about future trips, saying things like, We'll get through this. One evening he said, Do you trust me? I looked at him and answered honestly, I trust patterns. He frowned. What does that mean? I smiled. It means I'm paying attention. He laughed nervously and changed the subject. The idea to contact Lisa came to me slowly, not out of anger but curiosity. I wanted to know what Mark had told her, what version of himself he had sold. I sent her a message from a neutral account. I wrote, Hi Lisa, this is Mark's wife. I'm not looking for drama, I just want clarity. She didn't respond for 2 days. When she did, it was cautious. I didn't know he was still married in any real way, she wrote. We met at a cafe far from my neighborhood. She looked nervous, twisting her cup. I said, You don't owe me anything, but I need the truth. She nodded quickly. He said you were basically roommates. I laughed softly. We share a mortgage. Her eyes widened. She said, He talked about leaving. My chest tightened. When? She gave dates. They overlapped with vacations Mark and I had taken together. That was the twist I hadn't expected. Mark hadn't just cheated, he'd been living 2 futures at once. Promising her a life he was still pretending to build with me. When I told her about the receipts, the dinners, the lies, her face changed. He told me he was honest with you, she whispered. I shook my head. He's consistent, just not truthful. Lisa looked sick. I didn't know, she said. I believed her, not because she was innocent, but because she was clearly disposable to him. Before we parted, she said, He's still messaging me. My heart didn't skip, it settled. I know, I said. That night, I went home and watched Mark talk about work like nothing was wrong. Big presentation coming up, he said. I replied, Sounds important. He smiled. You always support me. I thought about the folders on my laptop. I do, I said, meaning something else entirely. I planned the dinner carefully. Mark loved showing off to friends, loved being seen as dependable and kind. I told him, I want to celebrate us trying again. His eyes softened. Really? I nodded. Really? I invited 2 close friends who knew us well and asked Lisa too, framing it as closure. She hesitated. I said, Truth works better with witnesses. She agreed. On the night of the dinner, I dressed simply, nothing dramatic. Calm was my armor, Mark noticed. You look beautiful, he said. I smiled. Thank you. At the table, glasses clinked, small talk flowed. Mark squeezed my hand under the table. I'm glad we're here, he whispered. I squeezed back, steady. When dessert arrived, I stood. I want to say something, I said. Mark looked surprised but pleased. I lifted my phone, my voice even. This is for honesty. Mark's smile froze. Lisa's breath caught. I unlocked the screen, knowing the story was finally ready to be told, and Mark had no idea what the next few minutes would cost him. I played the messages, the screenshots, and the photos I had collected over months. I held my phone steadily, letting the room absorb the tension before speaking. This is everything, I said calmly. Every lie, every hidden meeting, every false excuse. Mark's eyes widened, a flicker of fear passing before he tried to mask it. Lisa's hand went to her mouth, her eyes wide as the reality hit her like a wave. My friends leaned in, staring at the screen in disbelief. I continued, clicking through images of dinners, text messages, and emails, letting each one land like a pebble in a pond. I kept this not to destroy you, I said, looking at Mark, but to see the truth face to face. He stammered, I can explain, I shook my head. You don't get to explain anymore. His throat tightened. I never meant for it to go this far, I replied. Intent doesn't erase actions. The room stayed silent for a beat. Lisa, I said softly, you weren't special. Just convenient. Her face drained of color. I didn't know, she whispered. You were just a story he told himself, I continued. Mark's shoulders slumped, and he sank back into his chair, ashamed. My friends looked at him with disappointment, silent but piercing. I trusted patterns, I said, and you broke them. I stood, turned to leave, and said, this ends here. The divorce followed quietly, decisive and backed by evidence no argument could twist. Mark lost more than a marriage. He lost respect, trust, and the life he assumed was guaranteed. Lisa faded from our lives as quickly as she entered. Months later, my home feels lighter, my sleep deeper, and my heart freer. I learned that betrayal always comes with a price, and justice often arrives quietly. Truth heals, lies collapse under their own weight. Sometimes the hardest lessons come wrapped in silence. Betrayal doesn't need to shout to be noticed. It whispers, lingers, and slowly shifts everything you thought you knew. I didn't seek revenge through anger or humiliation. I sought clarity, evidence, and the courage to face what had been hidden from me. Mark's lies taught me to trust my instincts, to observe patterns, and to protect my dignity. And when the dust settled, I discovered that karma doesn't need to be dramatic, it only needs to be honest. The person who betrayed me faced the consequences naturally, and I reclaimed my life without losing myself. Remember this: love survives truth, but deception always has its own cost, and facing reality is the first step toward freedom.